The diner sat at the edge of a quiet American highway, the kind of place travelers stumbled into by accident and locals treated like a second home. Its neon sign buzzed faintly in the late afternoon heat, promising hot coffee, homemade pie, and friendly service. Inside, the air carried the comforting blend of frying bacon, sizzling burgers, and freshly baked biscuits. Families crowded into booths, truckers sipped from chipped mugs at the counter, and a jukebox in the corner hummed with the faint strains of an old country song. By the window sat a woman in her mid-40s, calm and composed. She wore jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and the kind of posture that spoke of quiet confidence. Her hair, streaked lightly with gray, was tied back neatly. She wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, she blended in like any ordinary patron. But there was something about the stillness in her demeanor that set her apart. She stirred her coffee slowly, eyes occasionally glancing outside, where the sun hung low and golden. The peace shattered with the sudden roar of engines. Motorcycles, at least half a dozen, thundered down the highway and pulled into the diner's gravel lot. Their arrival was impossible to ignore. Heads turned toward the windows as chrome and leather gleamed in the fading sunlight. The low growl of idling engines vibrated through the glass before silence reclaimed the lot. The door swung open and in came the bikers. They carried the air of men used to being noticed loud, brash, and untamed. Black leather jackets, patches stitched onto their backs, heavy boots clomping against the diner's floorboards. Their laughter filled the room, coarse and rowdy, immediately drowning out the gentle murmur of conversation. Patrons instinctively shrank back into their booths, eyes lowering to their plates. The truckers at the counter sipped their coffee a little quicker, hoping to remain invisible. The bikers spread out like a storm cloud, their presence filling the small space with tension. A waitress approached cautiously, her polite smile trembling as she asked what they'd like to drink. Their responses were deliberately loud, laced with mockery, earning chuckles from their friends. They weren't just here to eat, they were here to dominate, to make sure everyone in the diner knew who owned the room now. Through all of this, the woman by the window remained unchanged. She didn't flinch at the sound of their boots, didn't lower her gaze when one of them barked out a laugh loud enough to make the nearest family wince. She sipped her coffee, steady and unbothered, as though she were immune to the disruption. One biker in particular noticed. He was larger than the rest, his beard thick and unkempt, tattoos crawling up both arms and disappearing beneath his sleeves. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to picking fights and winning them. His eyes scanned the room, looking for something or someone that could give him a reason to show off. That's when he spotted her. There she was, sitting alone, calm in the storm he and his crew had created. Her composure struck him the wrong way. To him, it wasn't confidence. It was defiance. In his mind, no one ignored him. He thrived on reactions, fear, discomfort, anger, but this woman gave him nothing. Just that steady sip of coffee, her eyes barely acknowledging the noise. A crooked grin spread across his face. To his buddies, he nodded toward her booth. "Watch this," he muttered. They chuckled knowingly, eager for the entertainment. He swaggered over, heavy boots thumping against the linoleum. Conversations in the diner grew hushed. Every fork paused mid-air. Every eye discreetly followed the large man as he loomed over her table. "Afternoon, sweetheart," he drawled, leaning against the booth with his arm, blocking her view of the window. His breath carried the faint stench of whiskey and cigarettes. "What's a pretty lady like you doing all by yourself?" The woman didn't look up. She calmly stirred her coffee, tapped the spoon against the rim of the cup, and set it down. The quiet clink echoed louder than his words. She took a slow sip, her eyes fixed firmly on the steaming liquid. The biker's smirk faltered. He wasn't. Used to silence, especially not as a response to him. He leaned closer, his shadow falling across her table, waiting for any reaction. But still nothing. The diner was silent now. Every patron held their breath, waiting. The storm had arrived, and the woman, unknowingly or not, had just been chosen as its target. The silence inside the diner felt heavier with every passing second. Conversations had died down. The clatter of plates and utensils had gone still. And even the jukebox in the corner seemed muted under the weight of the moment. The woman's calm refusal to acknowledge the towering biker unsettled the entire room, though she herself looked as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. The man's grin stiffened into something sharper, meaner. He wasn't used to being dismissed, and certainly not in front of his crew. To him, her silence wasn't composure, it was insult. His pride demanded a response, and the glances of his buddies only fueled the fire. They sat back in their booth, watching eagerly, waiting for their leader to turn the quiet woman into the next piece of amusement for the evening. "Hey," he said again, his voice louder this time, the false cheer dripping into menace. "I asked you a question, sweetheart. Rude not to answer, don't you think?" His words carried through the diner, meant not only for her, but for the audience of townsfolk forced to bear witness. He wanted their fear as much as he wanted her attention. The woman's hand rested lightly on the handle of her coffee cup. She didn't raise her eyes. Instead, she took another measured sip, placed the cup down with deliberate care, and leaned back against the booth. Her expression was unreadable, her silence deafening. That simple act, the refusal to be rattled, was gasoline on the biker's growing anger. He straightened, towering over her, and turned his head slightly toward his gang. "Looks like she thinks she's too good for me," he sneered, earning a chorus of laughter from the others. The sound was harsh, ugly, bouncing off the diner's walls. The waitress, still hovering nervously with her notepad, froze in place. Her lips parted as though she wanted to intervene, but one look at the biker's size and his sneer robbed her of the courage. Instead, she quietly backed away, pretending to busy herself at the counter. The cook peeked out from the kitchen door, frowning, but did not step forward. The woman, however, remained utterly still, her face calm. She wasn't cowed. She wasn't rattled. To anyone watching closely, it wasn't arrogance that held her steady. It was something different, something stronger, as though she had weathered storms far worse than a loud man in a leather jacket. The biker leaned closer, his face only inches from hers now. His voice dropped lower, a growl meant for her alone, though the entire diner could hear. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me? I'm talking to you." His hand slammed down on the table beside her cup, making the coffee ripple. A few children at a nearby booth jumped at the sound, their mother clutching them protectively. The diner's tension was now thick enough to choke on, every eye fixed on the pair. The woman's eyes finally moved. Not to him, not yet, but to her cup, as though measuring whether to finish it now or later. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes met his. It was only a glance, brief and steady, but it was enough to unsettle him. They weren't the eyes of someone afraid. They weren't the eyes of someone intimidated. They were eyes that had seen worse, endured worse, and come out stronger. That silent defiance cut through his bluster like a blade. For the first time since he had swaggered into the diner, the biker hesitated. His mouth opened as though to say something, but no words came. His pride, however, refused to let him back down. He forced a smirk onto his face, masking the flicker of doubt that had surfaced. "Well," he said loudly, regaining the attention of his gang, "if the lady's too shy to answer, maybe I can help her loosen up a bit." His voice dripped with false humor, but there was an edge of frustration he couldn't quite hide. His buddies roared with laughter again, though it sounded thinner now, uncertain. The woman didn't flinch, didn't speak. She simply returned, her gaze to the cooling coffee, as though dismissing him with nothing more than silence. That small gesture was the breaking point. The biker's grin collapsed into a snarl. He had been mocked, humiliated, ignored. His pride burned, and his friend's expectant stares only fanned the flames. He straightened to his full height, his shadow draping over her like a curtain. His next move would not be words. The diner braced for what was coming, a collective, breath held in the stillness. The storm he had promised when he walked through that door was about to break, and she, calm, quiet, and unmoved, was the center of it. The diner seemed to shrink around them. Every patron could feel it, the crackle in the air, the way the biker's pride had swelled into something dangerous. His buddies leaned forward in their seats, eager for a show, their laughter sharp and cruel. They didn't come to eat. They came to dominate, to prove themselves bigger than anyone else in the room. And right now, all of that focus was locked on the lone woman by the window. The woman's stillness, her refusal to react, was like a mirror held to the biker's insecurities. To him, silence felt like mockery. Every second she denied him, the satisfaction of fear made his blood boil hotter. The smirk that once played on his lips twisted into a scowl. His pride screamed that he couldn't walk away, now not with his friends watching, not with the entire diner holding its breath. He leaned closer again, his voice low and venomous. "I asked you nicely, but maybe you need a little lesson in manners." His words slithered through the room, making even the toughest truckers at the counter shift uncomfortably. The woman didn't blink. Her hands rested on the table, her posture steady, as though she were carved from stone. Her eyes remained calm, but there was something in them now, a quiet, warning spark, the kind of look that said she'd endured far worse than this man could ever throw at her. But the biker was past noticing. His ego had taken over. In one sudden, violent motion, he reached out with a thick hand, grabbing at the shoulder of her flannel shirt. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the diner like thunder, sharp and shocking. The delicate seams gave way under his strength, splitting the fabric in an ugly rip that echoed louder than his laughter. Gasps erupted from every corner of the diner. A woman at the counter pressed her hand to her mouth. A child whimpered into his mother's sleeve. Even the waitress, frozen halfway with a tray of drinks, let out a small, horrified squeak. The biker grinned wildly, his chest puffed with victory. He turned his head toward his gang, expecting their approving laughter to wash over him. But the sound he waited for never came, because in tearing her shirt, he had revealed something he hadn't expected. The torn fabric slid from her shoulder, exposing the skin of her upper arm. And there, bold and undeniable under the diner's fluorescent lights, was the ink. A tattoo, not just any tattoo, but the Eagle Globe, an anchor of the United States Marine Corps. The lines were sharp and deliberate, the design unmistakable to anyone who had served or respected those who had. It wasn't new. It carried the slight fade of years, the patina of pride and sacrifice etched into her skin. It was more than art. It was a statement. The diner fell into stunned silence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Cups hung suspended before lips. Whispers rippled, hushed and reverent. "She's a Marine," someone muttered near the counter. The biker's smirk faltered as his eyes finally landed on what he had uncovered. For a moment, he didn't move, his brain struggling to reconcile what he saw. The tattoo stared back at him, every bit as defiant as the woman herself. The woman, meanwhile, remained composed. She didn't reach to cover it, didn't scramble in embarrassment. Instead, she sat straighter, letting the emblem be seen clearly by everyone in the room. Her calmness wasn't just silence anymore, it was declaration. The biker swallowed, his throat dry. That surge of pride he had felt moments earlier drained from him, replaced by something foreign. Doubt. His buddies, once eager for entertainment, now stared at the tattoo with unease. They knew what it meant. Even if none of them had served, they understood enough. That wasn't a symbol you mocked. And for the first time that night, the biker realized he may have chosen the wrong target. But his pride still fought him, clawing to keep its grip. He forced a laugh, hollow and weak, glancing toward his gang as though hoping to recover the moment. Yet no one laughed back. A sound of his own voice rang false in the heavy silence of the diner. Across from him, the woman lifted her chin slightly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The emblem on her arm spoke for her, louder than words ever could. And in that moment, everyone in the diner knew the balance of power had shifted. The storm the biker thought he controlled was about to turn on him. The silence after the fabric. Tor felt unnatural, as though the very air inside the diner had been sucked out. The biker stood frozen, his fist still gripping the torn edge of her shirt, but his triumph dissolved the moment his eyes registered what he had uncovered. The tattoo was impossible to mistake. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States. Marine Corps gleamed against her skin, inked in bold black lines with a precision that demanded respect. The light above caught the curves and edges of the design, giving it an almost living presence. It was not some delicate flower or whimsical heart he had expected to reveal. It was a mark of discipline, sacrifice, and service to a nation. The woman didn't rush to cover it. She didn't shrink into her seat. Instead, she sat straighter, letting the symbol be seen, letting the weight of it settle across the diner. Her calmness radiated louder than any raised voice could have. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a declaration, a reminder to everyone present that strength doesn't always shout, it simply exists. Whispers rippled through the room, hesitant at first, then louder. "She's a Marine," a trucker near the counter murmured, his voice carrying into the tense quiet. "No way," another replied, awe mixing with disbelief. But there was no denying it. Every person in that diner knew someone who had served. A father, a brother, a daughter, a friend. The emblem was universal, etched into the heart of the nation. And now here it was, displayed on the arm of the woman the biker had chosen to humiliate. A biker's gang shifted uncomfortably in their booth. Their smirks faltered, their laughter withered. They glanced at one another, unease creeping into their postures. Even for men who lived on the edge of lawlessness, there were lines you didn't cross, and one of them was disrespecting someone who wore that mark. The biker, however, stood trapped in the moment. His mind fought to process it, pride clashing violently with dawning recognition. He wanted to sneer, to brush it off, to laugh louder than ever. But something in the woman's steady gaze held him still, her eyes locked onto his, sharp and unyielding. They weren't angry. They weren't frightened. They were calm, steady, the eyes of someone who had seen fear, violence, and chaos, and walked through it untouched. That look pierced deeper than any words could have, stripping away the layers of bravado he wrapped himself in. The diner itself seemed to take sides. The patrons, moments ago powerless spectators, now sat taller in their seats. Some nodded, subtly, as if silently standing with her. Others simply stared, waiting to see how the man who had swaggered in so proudly would handle this sudden shift. Even the waitress, trembling at the counter, found her hands settling as she realized the biker wasn't in control anymore. The biker's throat tightened. His bravado, his laughter, his threats, all of it crumbled in the face of the silent. Truth inked into her arm. This wasn't just a woman he had tried to embarrass. This was a Marine, a protector, a fighter who had sworn to serve something larger than herself. He let go of the torn fabric slowly, his hand dropping to his side. His fingers flexed nervously, betraying the tension coursing through him. He could feel the stares burning into his back, his crew, the patrons, the woman in front of him. All waiting, all judging. Marine, huh? He muttered weakly, his voice stripped of its earlier strength. It was more to himself than to her, as though he needed to say the word out loud to make sense of it. The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. The tattoo spoke for her. The biker's attempt at a smirk flickered and failed. The weight of the moment bore down on him, forcing him to confront something he couldn't intimidate, couldn't mock, couldn't dismiss. Respect wasn't a choice here. It was demanded, silently, by the mark on her arm and the unflinching gaze in her eyes. And the longer he stood there, the clearer it became. He was no longer in control of this encounter. The diner remained. Still, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone could feel that something had shifted irreversibly. The question now was not whether the biker would back down, but how far he would fall before he did. The biker's world shrank to the space between him and the woman. The noise of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the restless shifting of patrons faded until all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. The tattoo on her arm seemed larger now, more commanding, as though it filled the entire room. He could still feel the rough tear of her shirt under his fingers, a sound replaying in his head like an accusation. His gang watched from their booth, their earlier amusement drained away, leaving only an uncomfortable silence. The man who had strutted in with such bravado was faltering, and they knew it. He licked his lips, throat dry, his usual arsenal of jokes and threats suddenly useless. For years, he'd relied on intimidation to get what he wanted, his size, his voice, his reputation. But now, none of that mattered. Not when he stood before a symbol that carried weight he could never touch. Marine, huh? He muttered again, but softer this time, almost reverent. His eyes darted nervously to her face, searching for some sign of weakness, some clue that she was bluffing. But her expression remained calm, steady, carved from stone. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That silence was worse than any shouted threat. For the first time in years, he felt small. The woman's gaze locked onto him, unwavering. There was no anger in it, no malice, no satisfaction. Just a quiet authority that stripped him bare. Those eyes had seen things he couldn't imagine: combat, hardship, sacrifice. She had stared into the face of real danger, and here he was, a leather-clad thug pretending to be a storm. His bravado collapsed under that gaze. He realized, with sickening clarity, that he wasn't the predator here. He was the fool. The whispers in the diner grew louder now, no longer just shock, but something more. A father at a corner booth leaned toward his son, murmuring, "That's a Marine. You don't mess with them." A trucker at the counter nodded, lips curling into the faintest smirk, as if silently enjoying the biker's undoing. Even his own crew shifted uncomfortably. One scratched at his beard, eyes darting away. Another muttered, "Man, let's just go." But no one moved. They were waiting to see what their leader would do, though their loyalty was waning by the second. The biker's stomach twisted. His entire identity was built on being feared, on commanding respect through force. But respect couldn't be stolen, it had to be earned. And here he stood, stripped of it completely, while the woman before him sat like a pillar of unshakable strength. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? An apology? A joke? Nothing seemed enough. Nothing could erase the fact that he had disrespected someone who had given a part of her life to serving something far greater than himself. The woman shifted slightly, straightening her posture, and the small movement made him flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She simply adjusted her torn shirt, letting the tattoo remain visible, and kept her eyes locked on his. That gaze was unbearable. It wasn't anger, it was judgment. Not just from her, but from everyone in the diner, from every unseen Marine who had ever carried that emblem, from the very idea of honor itself. His knees wobbled, though he fought to remain standing. His pride screamed at him to hold firm, to laugh it off, to reassert control, but his body betrayed him. Sweat prickled along his hairline. His chest felt tight, his hands heavy at his sides. The truth crashed down on him. He wasn't in control. He never had been. And in that realization, something inside him cracked. The biker dropped his gaze, unable to hold her eyes any longer. It was a small surrender, but it was the first. Around them, the diner waited, hushed and breathless, sensing that the mighty had just begun to fall. The woman, still silent, took another sip of her coffee. The small, ordinary act only deepened the humiliation. She was calm because she had no reason to be anything else. She didn't need to fight for respect. It followed her, demanded by the life she had lived. The biker finally understood. He hadn't embarrassed her. He had embarrassed himself. And the weight of that realization, pressed harder than any fist could dot the biker's hand, twitched at his side, his fingers flexing as though they wanted to curl into fists. But the urge to lash out was gone. The bravado he had carried into the diner had leaked from him like air from a punctured tire. What remained was a man standing unsteadily before someone he could not shake, could not intimidate, could not bend to his will. The woman moved at last. It wasn't sudden or violent. It was deliberate, calm, and utterly controlled. She placed her hands on the edge of the table and rose to her feet. The motion was fluid, unhurried, but it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. She was not just standing. She was claiming space. The biker found himself stepping back instinctively, though he told his body not to move. The shift was subtle, but everyone in the diner saw it. The predator had retreated, and the prey had become something far more dangerous. Her posture was perfect, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She stood with the bearing of someone trained to project authority, the kind of stance drilled into Marines until it became second nature. Though she said nothing, her very presence filled the room, steady and immovable, like a mountain rising out of the earth. The biker swallowed hard. The smirk he tried to force back onto his lips faltered under the weight of her gaze. He felt stripped bare, like a schoolyard bully caught red-handed. His gang shifted uncomfortably in their booth, their earlier snickers replaced by darting eyes and restless fidgeting. None of them wanted to meet her stare. The woman adjusted her torn shirt with deliberate calm, pulling the ripped fabric across her chest without once trying to hide the tattoo. She let it remain in full view, a silent reminder of who she was and what she represented. The tension in the room had shifted entirely. Minutes earlier, the biker had owned the diner with noise and arrogance. Now, every patron's eyes were on her, and their silence wasn't born of fear, it was born of respect. They weren't waiting for the biker to make his next move. They were waiting to see what she would do. The biker felt the weight of that truth crushing him. His gang, his audience, his own pride, none of it mattered anymore. He wasn't the center of attention. She was, and she didn't even have to raise her voice to take it from him. Her eyes locked onto his again, steady and unyielding. They weren't cold exactly, but they carried something heavier. Certainty. She knew who she was. She knew what she had endured. And in comparison, his leather jacket, his tattoos, his bluster, all of it looked paper-thin. For a moment, the biker's throat tightened, as if he might argue, might blurt out some cutting remark to salvage his pride. But the words never came. His voice had abandoned him. Instead, he stood in silence, exposed, under her gaze. Behind him, one of his crew muttered under his breath, "Man, let's go." Another shifted, clearly uncomfortable. Even his own men were slipping away from him. Respect had bled out of the room, and he knew he could never pull it back. The woman didn't move closer. She didn't have to. Her stillness was more commanding than any shove or strike could have been. She simply stood there, her tattoo bared, her presence radiating quiet strength. The biker's pride buckled. He had spent his life building walls of intimidation, but those walls collapsed under the weight of her calm authority. She had said nothing, yet she had dismantled him completely. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally his shoulders sagged. The fight, the swagger, the arrogance, it all drained from him. He felt smaller than he ever had before, and the entire diner saw it. A balance of power had shifted, and there was no going back. The woman, unbothered, lifted her cup of coffee from the table and took a slow sip. That small, ordinary gesture was devastating. It was a declaration that she was still in control, that nothing he had done could rattle her. The biker lowered his eyes. He could no longer meet her stare. And in that moment, the king of noise, the master of bluster, was reduced to silence by nothing more than dignity and strength. The diner held its collective breath, the silence so complete that even the faint hum of the neon sign outside seemed loud. The woman stood tall, her calmness radiating in a way that made every other person in the room sit straighter, as though they too drew strength from her unshakable composure. The biker, however, was unraveling. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darted, his jaw worked as though trying to grind words into existence that simply weren't there. Sweat traced down the side of his temple, disappearing into the tangle of his beard. For years he had thrived on fear, on making others shrink away, on watching them flinch when he moved too close. But now, with the weight of her gaze pressing down on him, he felt like a boy caught in a lie, stripped of every illusion of power. His crew had gone silent. No more laughter, no more egging him on. They sat stiffly in their booth, watching. As their leader faltered, their loyalty had cracked. They weren't going to swoop in to rescue his pride. The authority he had always lorded over them had vanished. Respect, once demanded, had fled the room entirely. The woman's tattoo glistened under the fluorescent light, old and unwavering. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, the biker saw himself for what he truly was: loud, hollow, and small. The silence grew unbearable. He had to break it. He opened his mouth, intending to spit out a joke, something crude to deflect the weight pressing on him. But when the words reached his tongue, they crumbled. His throat closed. He couldn't laugh this off. Not here. Not now. Instead, a different impulse rose within him, alien, uncomfortable, but undeniable. His knees wavered, his body trembling with the strain of holding himself up against the crushing shame. Then, before he could think, before his pride could scream, louder, his body gave way. With a dull thud, his knees hit the diner floor. A sound reverberated through the room like the crack of a gavel, final and absolute. A gasp went up from the booths, followed by stunned silence. Patrons leaned forward, wide-eyed, unable to believe what they were seeing. The biker, the same man who had swaggered and dripping with arrogance, who had terrorized small towns for years, was kneeling. His head bowed, his shoulders slumped, his hands hung limply at his sides. He muttered something at first, so low. It was nearly inaudible. The silence pressed on him again, forcing him to speak louder. I'm sorry." The words were raw, jagged, and humiliating. They scraped out of him like gravel, his voice cracking under the weight of them. He couldn't look up at her. He couldn't face those eyes, that emblem, or the quiet power. That had dismantled him piece by piece. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, her presence a towering reminder of what respect truly meant. Her silence was more powerful than any lecture could have been. The biker's crew shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. They had never seen him like this. To see their leader on his knees, apologizing to a woman he had tried to humiliate, it broke the mythology they had built around him. He wasn't untouchable. He wasn't invincible. He was human, fallible, and ashamed. The other patrons watched in awe. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others simply stared. But all of them knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning. The biker's voice cracked again, louder this time, as if trying to make sure everyone could hear. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. His words trailed off, swallowed by the weight of his own shame. For a long moment, the diner remained still. The only movement was the woman adjusting her torn shirt, calmly picking up her coffee once more. She took a slow sip, her gaze never leaving the man kneeling before her. Her silence said everything. Apology accepted, lesson delivered, respect demanded. The biker stayed on his knees, a moment longer, humiliated, broken. When he finally stood, it was without swagger, without smirks, without noise. He had been stripped down to nothing, rebuilt only by the acknowledgement of the strength before him. And though he would never admit it aloud, a part of him knew he would never forget the day he knelt before a Marine. For a long, stretched moment, no one in the diner moved. The sound of the biker's knees striking the floor still hung in the air, heavy as a church bell. His muttered apology lingered too, fragile and desperate, echoing off the walls that had once amplified his laughter. The woman said nothing. She didn't need to. She stood with quiet authority, her coffee in one hand, her Marine tattoo bold against the torn fabric of her shirt. That silence, unshaken, commanding, was more powerful than any words of anger or rebuke could ever be. The biker rose unsteadily, but the swagger was gone. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now darted downward, unable to meet hers. His hands fidgeted at his sides, as if searching for something to hold on to. He looked smaller, diminished, his pride shredded in front of everyone who had once feared him. His crew shifted in their seats, restless and uneasy. The smirks were gone, replaced by shame that clung to them like smoke. One of them muttered, "Let's go," and another nodded quickly. They slid out of their booth without a word. Not one of them dared glance at the woman. The biker lingered a moment longer, glancing back at her with an expression caught between guilt and awe. His mouth opened as though he might speak again, but no words came. Instead, he turned toward the door, his boots suddenly heavy, each step dragging as if the floor itself resisted him. The other patrons followed his exit with their eyes. Mothers held their children close. Old men at the counter exchanged knowing glances. A young boy whispered to his father, "She's a Marine," and the father nodded solemnly, pride shining in his eyes. When the last of the bikers pushed through the diner door, the jangle of the bell above it rang strangely loud. Outside, their engines rumbled to life, but even that familiar thunder seemed muted, stripped of the menace it had carried when they arrived. They roared away down the highway, their noise fading into the horizon like a storm that had passed without touching the ground. Inside, the diner exhaled. Conversation started again, hesitant at first, then louder as relief settled over the room. Silverware clinked against plates, coffee poured into mugs, and the jukebox quietly spun a tune that no one had noticed earlier. The tension that had gripped the air dissolved, replaced by something warmer: respect, admiration, and gratitude, directed at the quiet figure by the window. The woman sat down again, as though nothing had happened. She adjusted her torn shirt with a shrug, then lifted her coffee cup and took another sip. Her calm was unbroken, her composure intact. To her, the incident seemed almost ordinary, like brushing away a bit of dust. But for everyone else, it was unforgettable. The waitress, who had been trembling minutes earlier, approached cautiously. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Ma'am," she said softly, "are you okay?" The woman glanced up, gave a small nod, and offered the faintest smile. "I'm fine," she said simply. Her voice carried the same calm strength as her silence had, and it settled the waitress's nerves immediately. A murmur of appreciation swept the diner. Some patrons nodded in her direction. Others whispered to their companions about the courage they had just witnessed. For many, the tattoo on her arm wasn't just ink anymore. It was a story, a symbol of service that would ripple through the town long after the coffee cooled and the pie was served. The trucker at the counter lifted his mug in her direction. "Semper Fi," he said quietly, his voice thick with respect. She gave him a nod, no more, no less. And that was enough. The diner returned to its rhythm, but beneath the everyday chatter lay something deeper, a shared understanding that they had witnessed real strength, not loud, not violent, not cruel, but steady, quiet, and unshakable. The woman finished her coffee, set her cup down, and glanced out the window where the horizon stretched golden with the fading sun. She didn't look back at the door, didn't watch the road where the bikers had disappeared. Her calm said everything. The storm was over, and she had never been in danger. She was a Marine, and that alone commanded respect.